And welcome back to Servant Servant by Kurt Cobain by Danny Goldberg, released by Bradley Dahlberg in 2024. Up to Chapter 2, Punk Rock 101. In 1993, Kurt told journalist Robert Hilburn, "I was seriously depressed as a kid. Every night at one point I'd go to bed bawling my head off. I used to try to make my head explode by holding my breath, thinking that if I blew my head up, they'd be sorry. And there at the time when I never thought I'd ever see 21. In this book, Come As You Are, the story of Nirvana, Michael Azarek quotes Kurt's reflections on his childhood. I used to think I was adopted, and that they found me on a spaceship. I knew there were thousands of other alien babies dropped off. I met a few of them, and one day we'll all find out what we're supposed to do." Kurt's alienation as a teenager was magnified by having to grow up in a conservative logging town of Aberdeen, Washington, where his artistic sensibilities made him an outcast. The one Aberdeen band that found the following national punk pandemonium was the Melvins. And they had an incalculable influence on, I guess it's Kurt Cobain. Nirvana's early career, personally and musically, and in those days punk bands rarely drew more than 100 people to a show, and it was easy for fans to hang out with the group afterward. The Melvins' lead singer Buzz Osborne, aka King Buzzo, turned Chris Novoselic onto an indie band, Flipper. When I spoke to Chris in 2018, he still glowed when he was recalling the epiphany of hearing their album, Generic, as a teenager. Kurt first saw the Melvins perform in 1984, when he was 16 years old. Shortly afterward, Buzzo made Kurt a punk rock compilation tape that included songs by Black Flag and Flipper, and Kurt was mesmerized and for months would lip-sync to the songs every single day. And he told British writer John Savage that although he had enjoyed some of those melodies of the mainstream rock bands like Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith, most of the lyrics were dimensional, and a lot of it was sexism, and the way that he wrote about their dicks and having sex, and that bored me. Listening to punk rock, Kurt found his calling. The songs expressed how he felt socially and politically, and it was a huge relief that in some respects, at least he was not alone. There was another world on this planet, and he was determined to be a part of it. And Buzz soon introduced Kurt and Chris the next year to Melvin's drummer Dale Crover, played with Nirvana on their first demos. A few years after that, Buzzo introduced Dave Grohl to Nirvana. Punk fans are passionate about the music they love, and there are tumultuous arguments among the aficionados about the merits of different artists and what is or punk isn't. Discussions that I remain unqualified to address. What follows are the dumbed down way I, the interloper from different generation, was able to absorb some of what it was inspired Kurt in his formative years. The punk rock culture of the 70s in New York and the one that revolved around the Sex Pistols in London were the only peripheral interests to Kurt. He and Chris were galvanized in high school by a subsequent iteration of punk and other indie rock that followed in America in the 1980s, and although that movement was commercially limited, it took on the role of a secular religion to its fans, the center of which the group of the artists of the mainstream music business largely ignored. Between 1980 and 81, a few years before Buzz made the mixtape for Kurt, Flipper and Husker Du released their first singles on Mission of Burma, and Minor Threat released their EPs. The Minutemen, the Dead Kennedys, and the Replacements released their first albums. Henry Rollins joined Black Flag, and the Sonic Youth and the Butthole Surfers performed. All these bands had albums that appeared on many of the top 50 album lists that Kurt repeatedly made in his journals in an attempt to sketch out Nirvana's inspirations. There were numerous times I heard him naming these artists, and with such a tone of admiration that it sounded like a catechism. Unlike the old school rock groups who had formed in the 60s and 70s, these punk bands did not consider the commercial success necessary to validate their work and viewed popular music with a jaundiced eye. Black Flag was one of the first such bands that Kurt saw in person, and like their contemporaries, they played fast and they played loud. Greg Ginn of Black Flag created SST Records, and to release the music business, of course. In the 80s, SST became home for a dozen artists that Kurt loved. Ray Farrell worked with SST for years and was hired by Geffen Records a year before Nirvana went there. And when they first met, Kurt wistfully told Farrell, "I would have killed to be on SST. SST couldn't get bands booked in the clubs, relied on mainstream rock and roll audiences because they didn't have the visibility in the conventional rock media that influenced the talent buyers. Thus, SST and other indie labels like the Dead Kennedys, Alternative, Tentacles, and had to find different venues, including VFWs. VFW halls that hadn't previously featured live music. Young promoters emerged and created alternative touring circuit and cultivated a subculture that Nirvana later would enter. Chris remembers Nirvana's early tours in the circuit with a great affection. We had nothing else going on. We had this van, and we would just cruise down the highway. We went to Florida. We went to Canada. We were happy as clams. We would just get paid a few $100 every night, and that was plenty of money. In addition to music, the wider punk culture was also an inspiration to Kurt. Because most of the artists he loved received virtually no exposure, no commercial radio stations, and their records were carried at chain record stores. They usually had found small independent record shops, which had become a second home to a lot of punk fans. And these stores are now sold inexpensively produced punk fanzines, which had a distant aesthetic and also espoused various anti-establishment values, and among the most influential were Flipside, which began publishing in 1977, and Maximum Rock and Roll, which started in 1982. Mass publications ignored marginalized 80s punk at the time, and as did the Rolling Stone. This created a vacuum initially filled with Cream, which Kurt subscribed to as a teenager and later by Spin when it was launched in 1985. Other than fanzines, the primary media was connected to punk and to its small but passionate fan base with the college radio stations. College airplay was compiled in a tip sheet called the CMG, College Media Journal. CMG created the New Music Report in 1982, which became an important curator for emerging artists in the indie and punk underground. The music in this scene diversified over the course of the 80s. It was the punk if you did it your own way, says Pharrell. Some evoked the lyrical minimalism of the Ramones, but the 80s preceded an increasing group of punk rockers injected with a wider variety of musical influences, inviting the social and political consciousness into their lyrics. And among later, Fugazi's Ian MacKaye and the Dead Kennedys, Jello Biafra, were important role models for the political side of Kurt's persona as the 80s unfold. The solidarity that the indie artists felt with one another as outsiders replaced the musical style as the bidding force for the community, and that was the context in which the Sonic Youth was an aesthetic and owed more to New York's art scene than it did the Sex Pistols, and could emerge as mentors in the community. What this diverse group of punk rockers had in common were the values that Kurt would later interject into the corner of the mainstream rock culture, making music that personal, supporting other artists in the community, maintaining an egalitarian relationship with the audience. One of the paradoxes of my relationship with Kurt was that I associated with two of the cultural forces that a lot of punks demonized: hippies and major labels. The word hippie meant different things to different people at different times. By the 80s, long hair on men, which was rebellious in the 60s, had become part of the uniform of the conventional macho rock culture, hence the pejorative hairband. Even having some punk shows that guys with long hair were physically attacked by drunken fans who used the word hippie as an epithet. And some of Kurt's heroes were open-minded. They realized that the external symbols quickly became a passé, or a co-opted there through the line of sincere bohemian idealism and a meaningful art of every generation that included early hippie culture. Greg Ginn of Black Flag saw the 75 Grateful Dead shows. Ian MacKaye of Fugazi saw the Woodstock movie 16 times. Mark Arm recorded Bob Dylan's Masters of War as a single to protest the first Gulf War, and Mike Watt of the Minutemen cited the Creedence Clearwater Revival as the political band, in part because of the anti-war song Fortunate Son, and said that the shirts worn by Creedence prefigured the popularity of flannel as a regular guy uniform for punks in the 80s. And prior to forming Nirvana, Kurt and Chris had been a Creedence cover band. However, while I initially assumed that Green River, Mark Arm's band before Mudhoney, was a homage to Creedence album with the same name, it was actually a reference to the serial killer operating in Seattle at the time. Kurt identified at the times with both hippies and hippie haters. Shortly before Nevermind was released, John Rosenfelder, a young promo guy whom we all called Rosie, earnestly told him that there was enthusiasm for Smells Like Teen Spirit among some of the stoner college radio guys steeped in the psychedelics. Kurt sneerly replied, I want a tie-dye t-shirt made with the blood of Jerry Garcia. On other occasions, however, Kurt nostalgically remembered drinking beer in front of Jimi Hendrix's grave in Seattle. The song Territorial Pissings on Nevermind began with the phrase lifted from the 60s song Get Together, the most successful version of which performed by the Youngbloods. In a fierce, garbled voice that seems to mock hippies' anthem, Chris sings, "Come on now, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now." Many rock critics describe the intro as the single that Nirvana was mocking the peace and love era. However, Chris told me that they did not mean to impugn the ideals of the song, but were bitterly commenting on the abandonment of those ideals as the majority of baby boomers as they got older and more influential. The most complete answer Kurt gave in public about Get Together was an internal interview in Brazil's O Globe. The song speaks of who joined together to be cool and try to do something new. The ideal contrast to the macho men I'm portraying in Territorial Pissings. We didn't want to be offensive to the guy who wrote it. The idea of being positive and causing the change in society and the world was appropriated by the media, who turned it into something ridiculous, a caricature. And there was no ambiguity in Kurt's ritual smashing of his guitars on stage, which became a feature of many of Nirvana's shows in the band's career, which openly mimicking the Who's Peter Townsend, who originated the practice on stage in 1964 after the band played their 60s anthem My Generation. Drummer Keith Moon often followed suit by toppling over his drum kit, an action that Dave Grohl gleefully copied at the end of many of Nirvana shows. Instruments destruction fit perfectly in with the anarchy exchange of punk rock, but both Kurt's preconception with the Beatles was much more unusual for other artists in the subculture Nirvana emerged from. As Thurston Moore reminded me, the members of Nirvana would often coyly refer to the B word, as if listening to the Fab Four was a guilty pleasure. When it came to attitudes about the mass audience, most punk rockers were more like poets or avant-garde classical musicians than mainstream rockers. Nirvana mixed the signals about the 60s counterculture, one of Kurt's many indigenous cultural straddles, led British writer John Savage to claim that the very name Nirvana was a sarcastic commentary on the hippies' pieties, and though Kurt's explanations for the name was invariably respectful for the spiritual province, there was plenty of "fuck Woodstock" t-shirts at the UK's Reading Festival, and when Nirvana headlined it, however, Kurt and Chris both told me that they admired the 60s radicals like Abby Hoffman and Timothy Leary, and lamented the fact that their generations didn't have similar counterculture thought leaders. Moreover, the members of many punk bands shaved their, I'm guessing, heads. Shaved their heads or wore a mohawk, and the guys in Nirvana had that kind of long hair that would have a fit right in with Woodstock. For Christmas 1991, I gave Kurt and Courtney a bound Fascist Smile edition of the entire 18-month life of the San Francisco Oracle, the quintessential San Francisco hippie paper. Shortly thereafter, Kurt did an interview in which he pointed out that the Haight-Ashbury community had realized that the hippie symbolism had been drained of meaning as early as 1967, alluding to the death of the hippie march at the Oracle, and had prominently been covered and viewed through my baby boomer eyes. Punk rebellion sometimes seemed like the mere iteration of the adolescent angst popularized in the 50s movie The Wild One. The protagonist, Johnny Strabler, played by Marlon Brando, is asked what he is rebelling against, and the leather-clad motorcyclist solemnly replies, "What do you got?" Similarly, there is a cohort of punk fans for whom unfocused anger, tribal solidarity with other punks, and the shared taste in music were all there was. However, there were many currents of punk rock that inspired Kurt that also specified political subtext. In the 1980 decades, before Donald Trump emerged as a voice of an angry older white males, Black Flag anticipated their fear in the song White Minority. We're going to be a white minority. We're going to feel inferiority. Kurt's teenage years coincided with the Ronald Reagan's presidency from 1981 to 89, which was the catalyst for a lot of rage amongst American punk culture in the era, similar to the way the anti-war movement had influenced the 60s counterculture, and the opposition to Margaret Thatcher's conservatism had motivated the Clash and others in British punk movement. To this kind of young people who are attracted to punk rock, Reagan's homespun style of epitomized retro Hollywood phoniness. First Lady Nancy Reagan made the simplistic "just say no" anti-drug campaign the centerpiece to the national identity, which exacerbated the drug war. And while her husband was overseeing the dismantling of many of the programs that had been poor, Mrs. Reagan spent $200,000 on new china for the White House. Reagan was elected by huge majorities. Embattled punks in the 80s, having no mass cultural resistance against the administration to plug into, created one themselves. DOA released a song, Fucked Up Ronnie. The Minutemen wrote If Reagan Played Disco, and there was a hardcore band called Reagan Youth, and in 1983 Biffer's group, the Dead Kennedys, organized a Rock Against Reagan tour. And 2 years later, Thurston characterized Sonic Youth's Bad Moon Rising album as a rejection of the smiley face facade of Reagan's Morning in America election campaign. In 1991, after Nevermind was released, Kurt said, "The Reagan years have definitely set us back to where the average teenager feels lost, and there isn't much hope." Reagan's vice president and successor George H.W. Bush presided over the Gulf War, which seemed to be many of the punk cultures like a conflict that had launched primarily to protect the interests of the oil companies. Kurt and Chris felt isolated when the war had 90% of the approval rating and spawned ubiquitous yellow ribbons ostentatiously to symbolize the support of the troops, but often exacerbated by hawks to signifying the support of the war itself. One thing that brought together most people in the music world, myself included, was the optimism to Senator Al Gore's wife, Tipper, and other Washington wives, who organized an effort to ban the sales of albums with profane lyrics to minors, and many of the artists whom Nirvana admired were targeted. The Dead Kennedys album, Frankenchrist, included a poster to reproduction of the Swiss surrealist H.R. Giger's painting Penis Landscape. The picture is like Reagan's America on parade before proudly said. The poster on the album contained as if they were a subject of obscenity prosecution by the Los Angeles District Attorney and successfully defended by the Southern California affiliate of the ACLU, whose foundation board I chaired. There were those in the punk rock community who conflated the very existence of the corporate record companies with the conservative politics. I asked Michael Azerrad about the significance of the Reagan to the 80s punk movement, and he jokingly replied he was totally a major label president, and by the end of Kurt's life, I was such an executive, and like most of my peers, I detested Reagan's policies, but I also knew that Azerrad was adopting the voice of the typical punk fan, and at the time of his formulation reminded me of a tightrope that Kurt had walked. And in an interview for France Best Magazine of the year after Nevermind came out, Kurt said, "I had a tendency to reason in the terms of us against them, and since it's been a big part of the business, I realized that things unfortunately aren't that simple, and we meet people in huge companies that sincerely love music and are trying to make things evolve. And that being said, I understand how kids who like underground think we're sellouts. I used to the reason exactly like them. And even though the Kurt I met was ambiguous about wanting Nirvana to sign with a major label, the mystic of indies had been a part of his coming of age as an artist, and he never lost his respect for the indie culture. Without the existence of the labels such as SST formed in 1978, and Alternative Tentacles in 1979, Discord in 1980, Epitaph in 1980, Touch and Go in 1981, K in 1982, Homestead in 1983, CZ in 1985, and Sub Pop in 1988, and Matador in 1989, a lot of the music that inspired Kurt would not have been able to find an audience. And when Nirvana was trying to get a record deal, it was to such indies that Kurt sent cassettes and letters, and beyond the fact that he admired the music on those labels, they usually the only plausible options in those days for punk-influenced band. Not surprisingly, there were definite tribalism prevalent among many of those in the indie world, because those that were shoestring operations that paid little over to the artists or advance, and they were rarely in a position to acquire long-term contracts. Thus, major labels, in addition to their cultural orthodoxy, could represent an existential threat to the indies by by swooping in to sign their most promising artists after the smaller labels had the foresight to put them on the map. Husker Du, for example, made their first 3 albums on SST and then signed with Warner Brothers in 1986. I understood that the only way that many of the younger people at Indies could make the progress in the music business was by legitimizing previous generations. Musical trends are created by teenagers. A generation of music usually spans over 4 years, the length of time it takes to get through high school. There are always a few opportunities for small, ambitious people in their early 20s who can credibly claim that their elders don't get it. I had benefited from the singular formation as a long-haired hippie type, contrasting myself to straight, older guys when I was wormed my way into the business in the late 60s. Nevertheless, each artist has their own set of goals, and in indie fundamentalism wasn't for everyone. By the time I met Kurt, he had already concluded that while some aspects of the indie pride were legitimate, some attitudes were informed by the inverse snobbery that could be lame. And when it served his purpose, Kurt would point out by 1990, records by R.E.M. and the Stooges and the Ramones and Patti Smith and the Sex Pistols had been released in the United States on major labels with no adverse effect on those artists' music or credibility. And the big signifier for Nirvana was Sonic Youth. Thurston Moore told me in 2018 what the band's rationale was for signing with Geffen, and we noted that Husker Du music hadn't changed when they signed to Warner, and on independent levels we dealt with SST Records, Blast First Records, and Neutral Records, and if there wasn't an accounting, it was always somewhat suspect. With Geffen, we had an advance that would allow us to be able to pay our rents and get our health insurance and have a slightly better lifestyle, and maybe, just maybe, not have to work day jobs. And we felt like we could negotiate a contract that would make sense. Sonic Youth were secure enough in their place for the subculture to ignore carping from the indie fundamentalists. Thurston still bristles at the fact that the punk musician and indie label champion Steve Albini wrote a piece drawing up scenarios about how artists systematically get ripped off by a major label. Thurston says that he was so crude in his description, he ended his piece, "If you're gonna fuck a pig, don't be surprised if you get shit on your dick." I wrote a letter in response to Steve saying, "That's a very interesting scenario. There's only one thing you didn't mention in the example of the band getting butt-fucked by the corporate labels. They must really be stupid." By contrast, Thurston says, we went to every meeting. We knew what we were getting into. We knew where the money was coming from and who was spending what. I didn't feel like we were signing to a bluesman's contract, as Albini put it. We were talking to a bank, and we didn't feel like we were selling out. We were buying in. But even Thurston was occasionally torn between the adherences and indie ideology, and when he was functioned, and the way he functioned in the real world. In the documentary 1991, The Year Punk Broke, filmed after Sonic Youth had already signed to Geffen, he was shown telling young German fans, "I think that we should destroy the bogus capitalist process that was destroying the youth culture. The first step is to destroy the record companies." Chris Novoselic was 2 years older than Kurt, and was the one person who went on an entire journey with him from Aberdeen to the worldwide adulation. Chris knew how talented and sensitive Kurt was. Almost a foot taller than Kurt was at 6'7", Chris seemed to me like a big brother. Kurt never had, but minus the sibling rivalry. When I contacted him for his book, Chris repeatedly mused, "It's always good to talk about Kurt." Now in his 50s, balding and gray, Chris retains an almost childlike innocence and idealism about music and politics, and he still exudes an earnest, protective attitude about his bandmate. Some people thought that Kurt was lazy because he didn't want to go to work to go clean toilets as a janitor, but when it came to art and music, he wasn't lazy. He worked really hard. Kurt was one of his only handful of lead guitarists who played a left-handed guitar with normal stringing, so he had a few role models as a musician. Kurt almost entirely self-taught and never learned to read music. Some guitarists, including Duane Allman and David Bowie, who were otherwise left-handed, played guitar with their right hand. Kurt, like Jimi Hendrix, wrote with his right hand but played guitar with his left. Chris recalls that from the moment they met, Kurt was constantly writing and rewriting lyrics and composing music, and Kurt was almost prolific, a visual artist as he was musically. Chris remembers, I went to his apartment in Aberdeen one day, and he had drawings of this pornographic cartoons involving Scooby-Doo, and they were really good. Kurt was always sculpting and painting and drawing, and he could have gone to art school. He went to Olympia because there was nothing happening in Aberdeen. Courtney concurs. He had to go to Olympia to be exposed to people. Fuck you, Courtney. I hate hearing her name. Yeah, that Courtney Love. I hate you, bitch. Respected. He had to go to Olympia to be exposed to people he respected, who were into different kinds of music besides the Melvins and Black Sabbath. Olympia is 50 miles east of Kurt's hometown, with a larger population at around 50,000, and it is the home of Evergreen State College, a progressive school that doesn't give grades. Underground cartoonist Linda Barry and Simpsons creator Mark Groening had gone to Evergreen, and so would Toby Vale and Kathy O'Hannon of the band Bikini Kill, Carrie Brownstein of Sleater Kinney, and Sub Pop founder Bruce Pavitt and Calvin Johnson, founder of K Records, who also sang and played guitar in the initial local band Beat Happening. Olympia's central role in the punk scene of the 80s was fueled by Evergreen's radio station KAOS, which was also the policy requiring that 80% of the music it broadcast emanate from the indie labels. The station became a magnet for people who would later play an important role in the late 80s and 90s punk culture, including Johnson and Pavitt, who both hosted shows on the KOAS before they started their labels. Nirvana's second public appearance was a radio broadcast on the station in 1987. To help promote their release, K published a newsletter that featured an anthropomorphic version of the label's logo drawn in a cartoon style with the caption, "Our heroes battle the many-armed corporate ogre." Breaking the spell of the musical repression, Johnson also helped broaden the musical canvas of the indie rock culture. Azarad writes that Kay was a major force in widening the idea of punk rocker from the mohawk guy in the motorcycle jacket to a nerdy girl in a cardigan. As Stella Mars wrote in the introduction to The Love of Rock Revolution, The History of K Records, the preening cock rock god of the dominant music culture had been replaced by a new face of virility that was not afraid to cry, and that aspect of Olympia culture strongly resonated with Kurt. And from the very beginning of his career, he was into the subverting of the image of the macho frontman. Eric Erlandson, who had become the guitar player in Hole and close friend of Kurt's, says of Olympia, it was a true underground scene that had also had a connection to D.C. Washington, D.C. was the home of Fugazi and as well as Dave Grohl's previous band Scream. It was like a cool little incestuous club, but most people in it were warm and welcoming, and Kurt made an immediate impact to the Olympia cult music community. As Chris reminded me, Kurt had been writing songs for years. He'd been like 3 or 4 years of development of that skill that people in other bands didn't have. Nirvana started playing music in Olympia and Seattle, and were rocking with our contemporaries, but Kurt had years on them as a songwriter. Slim Moon graduated from high school in Seattle and in 1986 was among the groups obsessed with the Melvin fans and who would go to any show they played within driving distance. Moon remembers the Melvins usually showed up in Tiger Stripe van owned by their roadie who was Chris. Moon first noticed Kurt at some of the shows. Moon moved to Olympia to attend Evergreen, and although he didn't last long in college, he stayed in town because he loved the music scene there. One night, Moon and his high school friend Dylan Carlson were playing at a party in East Olympia and at a place called the Dude Ranch, which was the first time either of them actually spoke to Kurt, bonding over their musical admiration of the punk band Big Black. Kurt's unique aesthetic sense was present even back then. Moon recalls, Kurt was wearing a very distinctive trench coat. A couple months later, Moon went to a party where Kurt and Chris' new band was playing. Dale Crover of the Melvins was sitting on the drums, and that evening they called themselves Skid Row. They were changing their names every time they played at this point, says Moon, and Kurt was wearing a fake glam outfit, often including platform boots. Moon recalls it was obviously a parody, and what I mostly remember is that Kurt didn't play a guitar solo. He had a digital delay pedal, and it was like he was doing half guitar solos, which went along with the spirit of the parody. It was remarkable. And Moon started promoting the small shows himself in Olympia and booked Kurt's band for one of their earliest gigs. Moon admits that his friend Dylan Carlson decided that Kurt was a genius quicker than I did. Kurt remained friends with Dylan for the rest of his life, and it's likely that Dylan was the last person to see Kurt alive. Kurt was 20 years old at the time, and Moon didn't perceive the range of his brilliance until the day that Kurt played him a song, and it was a super catchy and catchier than almost anything that eventually went on the Bleach record. He says that it really struck me. He's messing around with all these different forms. He's wearing a denim jacket covered with the names of his favorite bands on Touch and Go and other indie labels, but he couldn't actually write a killer pop song. Even at this stage of his life, Kurt was sometimes attracted to drugs that weren't good for him, Moon recalls. I was moving and Kurt asked to help. He said that he didn't feel well, but when I said that I was the only person that I know with a car, he helped me pack up and opened the door and puked, and then helped me finish the move. It was nice of him, even though he was feeling like crap. I hadn't figured out that he was doing dope. Olympia, Moon acknowledges, was a tough place to be seen at school. It had a reputation as being elitist, and there was talk of cliques. Kurt saw what was cool about Olympia and wanted to be accepted by the cool people, and of course he was. The band was too good not to be accepted, Moon adds, and he was really funny at parties. He'd be really quiet and then suddenly capture the room. Olympia was also the center of the Riot Grrrl movement, which was starting to blossom while Kurt lived in there. NPR music critic Ann Powers, who used to write for the Seattle Music Monthly, The Rocket, has authored several books about feminism and the rock, explains Riot Grrrl, and was a punk rock with consciousness raised. One of the most influential Riot Grrrl bands was Bikini Kill, who released their album on Kill Rock Star's label, which Moon founded, and which also distributed by K Records. Kurt had a passionate affair with the Bikini Kill drummer Toby Vale when he lived in Olympia. Courtney acknowledges that Toby was the first woman Kurt was actually really in love with. Power notes that experience made him different from the Mudhoney or Pearl Jam. He lived it. He also was involved with somewhat of making a feminist music. Reading those classic books, thinking about the world through that lens, Kurt also influenced Vale. She told Everett True that she had learned a lot from Kurt about singing, including using the screaming as if the voice was a musical instrument. In every version of Kurt's life, the story includes that the fact of one night Bikini Kill's lead singer Kathleen Hanna graffitied over his bed, "Kurt smells like Teen Spirit." It was a reference to a branded deodorant Vale used, but Kurt, with his artistic alchemy, reappropriated the phrase for an entirely different purpose in his life, his most famous song. Courtney, who mutual hostility with the members of Bikini Kill has widely been chronicled, spoke to me about them in 2018 in a reflective tone. "I was never a fan of the music, but I loved their culture." Riot Grrrl and Courtney Love represent two strains of the thought in punk rock that Everett True describes thusly. There. Or bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, who believed that you